Hi, everyone. Welcome to another of our Yellow Wallpaper post-show chats. I'm Lindsay Holneds, the outreach coordinator for this production, and we have two wonderful guests here today. One of them is one of our humanities experts, and the other one is our director, to chat a little bit about the show and the context and the original work.
I'm Emily Auerbach. I've been a professor of English at UW-Madison for almost 40 years, as well as the director of the UW Odyssey Project. I'm happy to be here to talk about the show.
Hi, I'm Janine Gardner, one of the co-directors of the show. Trinity Gardner is my daughter. She's still in class currently, so she cannot join us. But yes, we were the directors.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, both of you. So first thing I want to touch on is, Emily, when you were watching the recorded version of the production, were there any moments, any artistic choices, anything like that that really struck you as an audience member?
Well, I think one thing that became evident in watching the music theater version of the Yellow Wallpaper is just how trapped we as an audience are in the room, in that space with our narrator, because we never go anywhere else. The same thing, by the way, happens in A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry, where you never actually leave the family's trapped apartment. In the movie, they go show other things, but in the actual play, Hansberry made sure that we were as trapped as the family was, just really wanting some sunlight and to get out. And so I think as you watch the production that Music Theater of Madison did of the Yellow Wallpaper, you feel like you're going just a little crazy along with the main character. You want to get out of that room. You want to get out of her head. So I think watching it visually, that was one thing that struck me, is that sense of confinement.
And Janine, were some of those choices intentional in creating the adaptation, and also some of your directing choices that you and Trinity made?
Yes, that's exactly what, because even in the text there is some ambiguity on whether or not she actually leaves, like during the 4th of July. And she's always staring out at the walkway. Cannot remember the word right now, but she's always staring out of the window, seeing the other people. And it was important to me to that isolation and that room gets smaller and smaller, because you are getting in her head a lot. Like there was no place to go. And again, there was sort of that ambiguity in the text, where did she go out? Was John in there with her? But I really wanted to focus on this being her trapped for this convalescent time that she had. And that's part of the reason that that she sort of gets obsessed with something. Like her mind had to hook into something, and I wanted to bring the audience in with that. So it's sort of a psychological thriller, if you will, where we're inside of her mind and we're not exactly sure what's real or what's not, what the wallpaper looks like, what it doesn't. The audience can come up with that themselves, as to what the woman in the room is seeing. And really, there were two women. There was Jane, and then there was the woman that she was revealing as she peeled back the wallpaper. And so it fills my heart with a little bit of happiness to hear that is how it came across, because that's what I was hoping. I don't want to traumatize anyone, but it was really about having the audience immersed in her brain, and not knowing what was real and what wasn't, and that these walls are closing in, and they're closing in on everybody, and obviously especially this woman who is isolated and trapped. in this room.
Well,
So
I also, another thing that I noticed was visually was that she starts out in this very prim and proper sort of Victorian garment with her hair in sort of a bun. She's very controlled and ladylike in the late 19th century way. So very repressed physically in terms of her fashion. But by the end, first of all, she's in a nightdress. Her hair has come loose and wild. And so as she goes sort of technically crazy, she's also more liberated. And that reminds me of the poem by Emily Dickinson, another great 19th century woman writer, who said, "Much madness is divinest sense to a discerning eye." And Dickinson was always looking at the way what we might call sane, normal, regular, proper, that could be very restrictive, and that what we might dismiss as crazy, insane, lunatics, that might be where freedom and imagination lived. And so it's a very ambiguous process, but we see the main character deteriorating mentally from the standpoint of outsiders, but we also see that she is finding increasing power and imaginative play. She goes in the text, when you read it, she goes from hating the wallpaper to actually looking forward to what she can do with it.
Yep.
So it is the power of a woman's imagination, even when restricted, that has to come out. And that's what we
that
see. It bubbles out there.
that's again, I am so glad that that came across, because that was again one of the important things is so her journal, we in the backstory that we gave her, her journal was something that was not supposed to be like, she was supposed to be John's wife, right? And this again, prim, proper, doing all of the things that are sort of expected of, you know, a white middle upper class professional's wife, right? There were these expectations for her, and she wanted to deviate from those expectations, which was part of, I think, uh, when she had a child. Again, this is the story, that the backstory that we sort of gave her, and she had a child, and again, this was the expectation, but she wanted more, outside of like family life, children. She wanted something for herself, and that journal was that thing where she could be creative and put herself into it. And so that's exactly what we tried to get across, is that in the beginning she was like, I'm going to, we had this bad experience beforehand before we came to this room. I don't want to stay in this room, so I'm going to be the prim, proper, perfect wife of a professional doctor. And I'll do that, and then maybe I'll, these months will fly by and I'll be able to leave and it'll be better. And sort of, but that journal was her secret and her way of being creative. And essentially, as she sort of devolved, because of being in the room and the isolation, like the isolation did the opposite of what it was supposed to do, especially being in isolation in this room, in this particular room. So that isolation did the opposite, but even at the same time, she goes, and the having the text up on the wall, which was Trinity's idea from day one. That's what she wanted, was the text on the wall. And having, I think it was said yesterday in one of the talkbacks that it's the writing on the wall, like we can even see it, we know, we're expecting it. And again, that was the intention, that the sort of writing gets sort of, it devolves, it goes kind of out of control, I would say would be the best way to put it. But as she goes out of control, she sort of gains control, because she gets what she wants, in that she can sort of be free and be creative, at what price? That's, you know, that's part of the ambiguity, at what price. But she does end up in a way becoming free, even though there's this like this dissolution, like this losing of her mind, essentially, I guess is the easiest way to say it. But I'm very glad that also came across.
Well, and it's interesting in the text where it ends with John fainting, so that he's taking on a sort of female weakness role while she's standing over him. I also find it impossible with the yellow wallpaper not to either read it, or in this case, watch it, without a consciousness of Charlotte Perkins Gilman standing behind it, because the story is so semi-autobiographical. And I think of the fact that the doctor who insisted that she have this rest cure after she had a baby, and labeled her as hysterical and all that, told her that she was to live as domestic a life as possible and never to touch pen, brush, or pencil again as long as she lived. So to be told that, see, that for me, as someone who, I work in the area of early women writers who were told to be silent. So we have, for example, Charlotte Bronte, she wrote to the poet laureate of England about her dream of being a writer, and he wrote back, "Women should stick to their proper feminine duty." And she tried to not write, but ended up writing Jane Eyre and other things that we're glad she wrote. Jane Austen hid pages of her manuscript under a sewing basket when visitors appeared, so it wouldn't look like she was a writer. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, her doctor told her she was suffering from brain fungus that afflicted women who tried to write. The governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony warned Anne Bradstreet that women who wrote could go insane. So you just have this whole tradition of men telling women, do not be artists, do not write, do not think. So the act of writing the yellow wallpaper is an outlaw statement. It's saying, I am a woman writer. I have a lot to say and think, and this will help me break out of the confines of my society's expectations for me. And I think one thing that I also noticed, because this was a musical, and so you have this beautiful singer all the way through, that's not in the text. We don't hear about singing, but it reinforces, I think, in the audience's mind that this is about a woman artist. This is a woman who has creativity. Everything our main character does is to transform the mundane, the practical, the prosaic into something imaginative and gothic. And, she personifies the wallpaper. She can create an entire life for herself just through her imagination. And I was thinking that it's particularly timely to have watched this during a pandemic, because I think, all of us have experienced now over a year of having to turn inward, where you can't necessarily go to the Overture Center and watch a show, or the museums and the libraries and other things may be shut down. You may not even be able to talk to other people or hug them in the usual way. A lot of us have been very trapped and having to look within in order to create a life. And so I think watching and reading the yellow wallpaper during a pandemic, it took on a special resonance, I think.
That's what I've also been saying this entire time, is the isolation that she feels. We all, I think, can understand exactly where she's coming from in that sense, because this was isolation. Isolation also in a place where I think there were a lot of bad memories. And again, in my mind, it was the nursery. Although, again, in the book, not really sure. But in my mind, it was the nursery. And so, like, having to create a life stuck in a room, and I especially identified with that, which is partly why I was like, oh, I will so do this show, because you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, I was pregnant, and I was due in June, but I knew I would have to go beforehand, and because it was so new, and there was this unknown, as to whether or not, you know, everybody had it and was just walking around with it, and so, you know, and then we have to isolate. We've never done that before, you know, in our lifetime. We've never had an isolation like this on such a global scale, of lockdowns, of we can't. So I actually isolated from my family just in case, because I'm carrying this life that can't, you know, protect itself. And so, you know, it was about almost a month of isolation in a room from my family. And so reading that again, that's why I kind of hooked into it, is I very much identified with that, because in that, where do you create, where do you create life? Where do you create, right? Because you have to, you can't see the outside. And so you have to, imagine, and write, or well, in any medium, write, read, the, you know, television, and lots of Netflix binging, right? There's all these ways to create a story about where you are, and I think that that's exactly what she did in in the narrative, is, as much as the walls were closing in, um, she used her journal to create, and you know, and like you said, Emily, everyone being told at the time that you can't create, whether, I mean, whether, you know, be writing, you know, opera singers were not looked on as the best, although everybody went to the opera and enjoyed it. It still was not a prominent profession, to where you're lauded. It's just a form of entertainment, that really women, um, were not, like, held on a pedestal because of it. So there's all these different forms of, again, creativity that women especially could not partake in. And then during this time of it's just me, what do I do? How do I create? How do I see the life that's outside? And how do I make myself a part of it? Is just such a huge question, and a big part of the narrative.
And I'm glad you brought up about being pregnant too, because another aspect of this production and text that I'm intrigued by is the portrait of a woman going through postpartum. You know, sometimes you could call it a disorder, or just, you know, very extreme postpartum reactions. But, you know, just to put it in our own time, one of the people I collaborate with the Odyssey Project, or have in the past, is Sagacious Livingston, who published a book called Infamous Women, and Infamous Mothers. And it featured a lot of my Odyssey students, telling the story of their own lives, of being labeled for being a teen mom, or, you know, for being incarcerated, for various things that they went through in their lives. And Sagacious, when she was talking about the book, talked about how in our society, we have a mom give birth to a baby, and then we put them at home and go away and expect that they're going to be, you know, so here you have this sleep deprived mother with a crying baby, you know, hour after hour. And you know, we don't surround them with the kind of village that a lot of cultures do. We sort of think, okay, mom, go take care of your baby 24/7. Aren't you happy? And sometimes it doesn't work. And sometimes people really do go crazy with the hormones and the changes, and the, you know, just how extreme the change can be. And particularly for some women, where, like the narrator of the Yellow Wallpaper, who talks about how she's not sure that this was what she was meant for. Or for Charlotte Perkins Gilman herself, who had a daughter and wasn't sure that was the route for her. I think this story raises a lot of questions about our expectations.
That's again, exactly like what I hooked into. So I'm a doula, and I'm working towards nursing and midwifery. Um, and I firmly believe in the fourth trimester. So the fourth trimester is after a person is given birth, and they're handed this baby and they are sent home. Um, there is still so much growing that is now taking place on the outside, and it's a growth between the baby and the parent, um, and they absolutely need the help the same way that we support them during pregnancy, during labor and delivery. We need to support them during this postpartum time, because it's, it's when they need it the most, when they're still trying to figure things out, when uh, everything is overwhelming and you're not getting enough sleep, which is vital, and can cause so many different emotions and a range. And so we have a lack of knowledge about postpartum depression and postpartum mood disorders and postpartum psychosis, which is what in my mind is what the woman in the yellow wallpaper was experiencing, was postpartum psychosis. And to have it labeled as hysteria, and treated in ways that were not going to benefit her, and get her well. In fact, what they did, like what they prescribed as treatment, made it worse. And that's why we have the yellow wallpaper and this sort of, devolution into, madness. That's why we see this, is because there was no support. And this is even again from someone from you know upper middle, middle upper class white woman who would have the means to have the help. And in fact, again, as we did a back, like we wrote a back, or I should say Megan wrote a background and we discussed it. It was that she probably would have had some sort of midwife, probably a Black midwife, that would assist her, and that could have gone postpartum. But then at some point, John, being the all-knowing husband, as a lot of men, as you pointed out, were wont to tell women at the time, that you can do this by yourself. This is what you were meant to do. We don't need the midwife anymore. And perhaps she still did need the midwife, or she needed something to help her get through it, even as a white middle class. And that would have been, much different if you were a person of color, if if you were of a poor social, economic class. Like it would have been different. And even having these, there still was this mental health barrier and issue that caused all of this. And so I completely agree with you that we need to focus on giving parents that support, because these are the mental health issues that can come up at during that time.
And I also think it talks about a broader attitude towards women's health. And you use the word hysterical, and that's also in the text, right in the first page, where she gets labeled hysterical. And if you look at the origin of that term, and the womb, and the idea that if you have a hysterectomy, you get rid of that hysteria and so on. I think women continue today in the 21st century to be given less good medical care sometimes because they're not taken seriously. I've seen that with my own 2 daughters versus my son. I would argue that if my son showed up at an ER and said he had something was bothering his stomach, or, you know, he had chest pain, they would think, oh my goodness, let's take him in and do some tests. Whereas if, you know, my daughters had the exact same symptom report, immediately the wheels are turning. Oh, I wonder what she's worried about. This might be emotional. Maybe they're hysterical. Maybe it's some kind of, you know, psychological problem. They've shown that women do not get the same kind of serious health care that they need because of these lingering ideas. And so, I think the document opens up, so the text and the show, we're asked to question everything now, not just then, because a lot of these issues are still with us. The stigma around mental health, the attitudes towards new mothers, the prejudice against those who are experiencing some kind of psychological need that's different, those who are outside of the box. You know, if you imagine this narrator having to color in the lines, she wouldn't have colored in the lines, and she might have been labeled, you know, problem child in school because she was drawing swirls and something else. I mean, I think this production asks us to look at all kinds of questions about how we judge people. And, you know, with John, we're told over and over that he's practical, he's reasonable, you know, he's this solid, rational doctor, but he's missing out on the visionary nature of his own wife.
That's exactly it. John is this, you know, oh, he can he's, you know, even keel. He's not going to go, you know, emotional and off the rails. I mean, how many times do we still hear, oh, is it that time of the month for you? Or like, you know, because show any emotion as a woman and you get labeled, yeah, you get labeled angry, you get labeled sensitive. And going back to your point of taking one child to the doctor versus the other, presenting with different symptoms, because things look different in different bodies. It's ADHD. Let's take that. It is wildly underdiagnosed in girls. In kids that you know, are femme presenting, because it looks different in their body than it does in someone who is, you know, in a masculine body. It looks completely different. And it is always, you know, oh, well, she was just being emotional, she was just being sensitive, she, you know, all the characteristics for ADHD, you know, just as an example. They dismiss it as just a girl's problem, a woman's problem. It's got not, you know, it's not that they're neurodivergent and have learned differently or see things differently. They get labeled as lazy, as, you know, inattentive, as chatty. Oh my goodness, because hyperactivity doesn't mean just a whirlwind going around. It can look like somebody who has difficulty in stopping talking, right? I was that child. And so then they get taken out of class. Like, it's the way that the healthcare system still views you know, girls, women. It's still a throwback to that time of when John, you know, this great and wonderful husband who will, you know, be able to take control of his wife. That thinking that happened then is still happening today, which is why I think the text was so important when I read it.
And it even goes beyond the healthcare area too, because I did a Wisconsin Public Radio show. I do University of the Air for Public Radio. And one of the shows that I did interviewed someone who looked at gender bias in hiring. And she does workshops all over campus. But if you take an essay and a resume by John Doe, you duplicate it and put the name Jane Doe, on it and you give it to a whole bunch of people to evaluate just based on what's written down there, they and you know, it's just so discouraging that this is still with us today, but they will put adjectives like masterful, strong, you know, determined when they think they're reading a statement from John. But you switch it to Jane, you're going to get emotional. It's the same exact words, the same CV, but suddenly our reaction is different. We color it through our lens, through what we think of the different genders. So, you know, you see that in this. And when John faints at the end, that calls everything into question.
And we didn't have John.
I know. Why not? Why didn't you have him faint? I was waiting for the faint.
The fainting. So he did it the first night when he came to you know, rehearsal, and he did it, and I was like, oh my gosh, I would. It was hilarious, and I think I mean, it would have brought a little brevity, you know, to the situation, but because we weren't going to have Megan crawl over him, I didn't want to put too much. And now that you're talking, I'm like, we should have just done it. We should have just had him, because he did a really good pratfall that first night, and it was hilarious. And I think it's still, even if it did bring that you know, that little bit of levity. There we go. That's the word. That's the right word, correct?
Levity, yes. Yeah.
There we go. To the situation, it also is a great flipping the narrative of, well, you know, this person, this big doctor who is so, you know, he's in control of his emotions. He, you know, is this, you know, bastion of like manliness and wonder, and he faints.
Right. He is now the invalid. He is now the weak one. And I think that
Yes.
that's important. I did like the way the production starts at the end with him calling, you know, so you know, that does not happen in the story itself.
Right.
But I like to have that sort of start at the end, and then we kind of get to that point and circle back. So I did like that.
I do think if you had John faint though, like Janine, you're saying it was like funny. I think when you all were planning the production and trying to make it like kind of a psychological thriller kind of horror tone,
Yep.
I feel like you provide comic relief at the very end of the scary story. Maybe that doesn't work, right? Whereas I feel like in the story itself, it's, when you read that last paragraph, it's very like jarring, like, oh, okay.
It is.
And
It is.
but then in the play, I feel like either there'd have to be another moment with Megan or something, because if it ends with him fainting, it isn't as scary. Right? Like I feel like there would be giggles.
Right.
And if that
There-
faint
there-
happened earlier and there's some comic relief, but at the end you want people to be like, oh my gosh.
Like, and because they're deaf, because he was so good at it, and it was unexpected and we hadn't seen it yet. We did all laugh because it was a great moment. And you know, again, I think that levity could have been nice, but like, we weren't gonna have Megan crawling over him, and I really did like the way that Megan ended with, you know, the last line, which is like, you know, you and Jane, because all of a sudden she wasn't Jane anymore. She was the woman that she had, said, like, her brain had actually, like, literally it had fractured, and so now she's the woman from the wall, and you know, crawling over John after he falls would have been a great moment. But it was that's harder to translate on stage because of a pratfall and the way that excuse me, and the way that he came in. It would have been there. Yeah, it would have been a moment of a lighthearted moment, where although it would have been a great moment to have that dichotomy, that you know, the complete opposite of like with men don't faint, that's women, that's why they had smelling salts. Well, if the corsets weren't so tight, and like that's partly the reason why there was fainting spells all the time. When you can breathe, that's a good thing. But so men didn't have that, so to have had him faint
Yeah.
would have been yeah, I really agree that it would have been a great moment, but I think it would have been a moment of levity, and we saw that the first night that Sean came in, and he did a fantastic fall, and we're like, oh, we all
Too
laughed. It
many
was great.
giggles.
Yeah, well, it's
Lots
good
of giggles.
it's good that you can both watch the production with the choices made there and then read the text and have both, because
Yep.
there's special qualities to both. And I do congratulate you on a wonderful production.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I want to go back for a second. So one point that I think is really interesting, and is interesting in the context of, Emily, what you said about Jane, our protagonist, as an artist and as a writer. I think I find it very interesting that this privileged white woman has the luxury of having the rest cure and just like sitting around and doing nothing, which obviously she doesn't want to do. But now, if we look at mental health care, journaling and writing is often an integral part of therapy. And so I think it's really interesting. And I also think that there's the other issue of, okay, this well-off white woman can just sit around, whereas mental health care for people of other races and other classes really didn't exist in the 19th century, unless people were, institutionalized or cast out from society, right? So I think that contradiction is very interesting. And how do we think that's evolved, right? Like, we've gone from rich white ladies getting to just sit around because that's what's best for them, because that's the feminine thing to do, to let's all write about what's going on in our lives and our feelings as a curative thing or as a therapeutic thing.
Yeah, and I mean, we have a long way to go still with mental health treatment, and also with health equity, and who gets care, who has the luxury to get care, the income to get care. So we definitely have a long way to go. And I wish that we could say that Charlotte Perkins Gilman was, really active in working towards equity for the races, but she was not. She had some big blind spots of her own. And but I do think, as with other texts, that you can take a story about oppression, lift it off the page, and then apply it in other ways. That's what we do when I teach in the Odyssey Project. We will read works by dead white men, like Plato's Allegory of the Cave, and apply that then to being in South Side of Chicago dealing drugs. We can take something and apply it. Or we'll take Ebenezer Scrooge out of Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol and make him into a modern day landlord. You can take the yellow wallpaper and make it work for a whole lot of different readers. I also think of this story in terms of Sylvia Plath, another example of an American author who dealt with what we would now label bipolar, who had postpartum psychosis, who was trying to be a writer at a time when she was also being steered into being domestic and to being married, and ended up committing suicide. And I think that, a woman writer who is trapped in a life that doesn't allow her to use her gifts, that often leads to tragedy. And we've seen that in everyday life. Many of us know someone who was in a situation where they were deeply miserable. We've also seen writers who were not allowed to use their gifts.
I completely agree with that. There are so many who have been stifled, and again, whose mental health was misdiagnosed, mistreated. They were mistreated, and when you have no outlet, when you have nowhere to go, that dissolution, that feeling of um, the feeling of loneliness, the feeling of emptiness, you know, where do you go with that? Um, where do you go with that when you're not getting the right treatment? Which I think happened, um, which I think happened back then, and I think it happened. It obviously it happened to people of Gilman's stature. Obviously, I think they were of a better position to. I mean, because if you look at the rest of Gilman's works of her ideologies that she put out, it was definitely not inclusive. It was very exclusive. Um, uh, and so even with her, she had difficulties accessing those types of care uh, that would have assisted and helped her. So what if the rich white ladies can't get the help, then what are we seeing? Because I'm coming from a health promotion, health equity, and gender and women's studies background, and so health disparities are like at the forefront of my mind always. So if Gilman can't get help, how does that translate to the people who had even more piled on? And like um I mean, if you look at slavery, like they had so much more trauma and harm done to them, uh in the sense of um just general life, and in of life in general. There we go. Not even mentioning mental health and stability, and that still is a problem today. There's still those disparities happening that are keeping marginalized folks down, and having that access to the therapies that are needed today it's ridiculously hard to try and access them. And speaking from, again, personal experience at trying to have my children access the healthcare, the mental health care in particular that they need, has been ridiculously hard to for them to get their medication, for them to have a therapist that they can see weekly that insurance will cover. It's just having the right insurance. I mean, I recognize my privilege, as my husband has a good job that with good insurance, and we have that ability, but and not everybody does. So there's so much, there's such a gap that needs to be filled, and needs to be the equity, not even equality, the equity to the healthcare needs to be addressed, and it's something that I fight for on a daily basis in my personal life and in my professional life. So yeah, I just wish that even in these works from late 1800, still happening today in 2021.
Yeah, I think we have the same conversations so many times, you know, about gender issues, about issues of race, about issues of health equity, right? Like there's so many conversations that this story and this musical can bring up that are still incredibly relevant today. Um, and as readers and viewers of the piece, understanding the context in which Gilman wrote this piece, and the world in which she was living, and how that is different, but also similar to the world in which we're living, and what issues come up, I think is really important. And it's important for us as viewers to look at it through a critical lens, right? Not just hold it up on some pedestal, but like look at what else is going there, and look at Gilman as a human being, and look at her other work, and kind of bring our own viewpoints to it as well. So we are getting close to our time. So I just wanted to say, if either of you have any kind of final comments for our audience, final things you want to say about the production or about the piece, that would be wonderful, and I would appreciate it. Emily.
Sure. Well, I noticed that in the essay that Gilman wrote called Why I Wrote the Yellow Wallpaper, which was published in 1913, she says it was not intended to drive people crazy, but to save people from being driven crazy, and it worked. I don't know if it worked, but it certainly tried. You know, what she did, I think, opened up a door into a woman's inner world, into the mindset of anyone struggling with mental illness, into all kinds of thoughts and ideas. And I think the Music Theater of Madison musical production did the same. And so, you know, reading the text and watching the show really, I think, is an exercise in an imaginative journey. And I think of the Emily Dickinson poem, I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, superior of doors, where possibility, you know, the poetic imagination, it's like being in a house that is open to the sky and has no walls, the opposite of the Room of the Yellow Wallpaper. And I think both the musical and the text remind us to celebrate the power of art to break down barriers and transform lives.
So thank you, Emily. Janine.
I would so agree with that. Art is absolutely a way to celebrate life, even if the material is dark. There is a way to, one, connect with the work, and especially I think with this piece, there's so many different layers, that you can bring out and connect with, and find a connection. You know, I can go back and watch it and be like, oh, there's something more that we could have done here with this, because there was just, it's so rich in material. And I would say, like, take it, find a piece that you can connect with, and enjoy, and also, I would say also connect with it, and also see where change and growth can happen from it, because there is a whole lot of that as well, that is there, that she opened a door with it. She didn't quite do what she said when what she wanted, but I think we can take it, and create change, where we see those parts of life, and we can create change, and that's my life's work. So that's what I would say, the take home.
Thank you so much for joining us, both of you. To our audiences, please tune in to all of our post-show chats, all three of them with our different humanities experts and our production and artistic team. Also take a look at our audience guide if you haven't had a chance to do that, because it has lots of additional information about some of the topics that we've talked about today and in the other chats. So thank you for tuning in. We really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good to talk to you.